Hi, my name is Ashanté Reese. I am an assistant professor in the Department of African and African Diaspora Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. And I have been invited to do this short lecture for you on refusal as method. And I'm really looking forward to talking a little bit about my thinking about this and where my thinking started and hopefully some practical things for you to consider while you're doing your own work. So first, I would like to just start with a little bit of a story. Some of you may have read about this in a column that I wrote for Anthropology News about a year or so ago. And the column, I talked about refusal as a form of care. I was attending a neighborhood association meeting in the neighborhood that I was doing my research in DC. And I had been invited to that meeting by the association president, and I was looking forward to it. They had invited me to be able to talk a little bit about my work and to perhaps get people information if they wanted to interview, if they were willing to allow me to interview them, etc. So I present about my work. I stand up, I talk about I'm an anthropologist. I am studying food access and to some degree food justice. I'm interested in community perspectives, not just a top-down perspective. And it was really received well. And one of the people who spoke up first was an elder in the community who I could tell was really important and had a lot of influence on other people. And she said that she wanted to talk to me and she gave me her number. And so again, I'm excited. I had done what people should do when you go into the field. You go where the people are and you try to make relationships and you try to you try to figure out where it is that you need to be. So I had done that and it had paid off. And then I called this elder a day or so after, and she does not want to talk to me. And I think, this matters for a number of reasons, right? Like why doesn't she want to talk to me? Wasn't necessarily the question that I've sat with, but more so thinking about how do I think about this as a lesson that I can take into thinking about not only someone's right, but the process through which they draw boundaries around wanting to talk to me or anyone else who's doing research, and the process through which they decide how and when to talk to me and about what, right? So those are the questions that I had been thinking about. And then also in this moment, there was something that I really learned about myself, and I think about my politics while I'm doing ethnography. And that is to say, I was presented with this question of, do I continue to pursue this and try to get her to talk to me at another time? Or do I let it go? And the thing that I learned about myself as an ethnographer is that I'm not particularly persistent. Once someone tells me that they do not want to talk, regardless of what those reasons are, I believe them. And then I keep, trying to learn what I want to learn through other avenues. So I just share that story as one way of thinking about how we might encounter refusals in our work. It's certainly like one of the first ways that I encountered refusal in my work. And of course, I had thoughts like, did I do something wrong? Maybe. Did I catch her on the bad day? Maybe also. Was there a different way that I could have approached her to talk to her? Yes, also, of course, all of that is maybe. But I think what I want to talk about over the course of the next 10 minutes or so are less about whether or not I did the right or wrong thing, and more about how we might recognize, accept, and actually embrace refusal, both as ethnographers, but also the refusals that show up through our research participants. So I am not the first, I won't be the last person to talk about refusal in my own work or, in my activism, right? And I think refusal has some deep intellectual roots that I want to pause and just chat about a little bit. And here, of course, those roots might extend well beyond, they do extend well beyond what I have here, but I just want to highlight some work in Indigenous studies and some work in Black feminist theory. And again, this is not to encapsulate everything that is written about or has been done on refusal, but these are people and works that have really influenced my own thinking. So Audra Simpson wrote the book Mohawk Interruptus that is really helps me think about refusal's relationship to sovereignty. Eve Tuck and Kei Wang Yang wrote an article called Our Words, Refusing Research. And then when we think about Black feminist theory, Tina Campt, Sarah Haley, Saidiya Hartman, my own work, Savannah Shangay, and all of these books, Listening to Images, No Mercy Here, Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, Black Food Geographies, and Progressive Dystopia, we can see different engagements with refusal, right? And one thing I want to highlight, one of the reasons I want to highlight these texts, because they're textured, they're nuanced, and they're very different ways that people are highlighting refusal in their work. But there is a thread that I think runs through them. And I think that in part is that each of these formulations, scholars are asking us to think about the role of the state. They're asking us to think about sovereignty, and in some cases, asking us to think about the violence that the state inflicts, and how people, our research participants, our interlocutors, how are people navigating that? And how might we think refusal as one strategy for navigating? How might we think of refusal as one strategy for exchange, particularly between an interlocutor and an ethnographer? I also think that I want to highlight something about all of these texts, which is that there is a necessary attention to space and place, a claim to space, a claim to place, a taking up of space, an altering of space. And I mention this because at least in my view and in my training, I didn't always feel like anthropology prepared me enough to really engage space and place, not just as the site of where I'm doing my field work or the site of where things are happening, but really theorizing space and place. And I think all of these texts that I mentioned engage refusal in a very spatial kind of way. And I think, in Black feminist applications of refusal in particular, these questions are also attending to how refusal as a practice makes spaces more livable. And here I'm thinking about a set of questions that Christina Sharp evokes in her essay, And to Survive, right? And she's drawing from Saidiya Hartman's work. And it's really this iteration of, can I live? How can I live? And it goes on for this entire paragraph. And I think it's worth thinking about how refusal is a part of animating this question. Can I live? How can I live? Where can I live? And how does refusal allow me to navigate those things? So here is that set of questions from Christina Sharp that I mentioned. And I just want to call attention to this second part, which is, how are we to practice care? How are we to attend to and refuse these presents and make new ones in accountable and meaningful ways? And here Christina Sharp is invoking refusal, and not just evoking refusal in the way that we might think a research participant does, but also invoking refusal as a we, and how we are showing up to the work, how we are showing up to the space. How might we also be engaging in the practice of refusal? So how are we to do that, right? How are we to practice care and honor refusal in our own ethnographic work and in our activism? I think I have a few things to say about that I hope will be helpful. But first, I just want to call attention to the fact that refusal might show up in two distinct but maybe related ways. There are the examples that I mentioned, right? The ways that interlocutors will employ refusal in their relationships with you, in their relationships with trying to figure out you as a researcher and how to navigate that research relationship. There are also ways that refusal shows up with interlocutors in their everyday life. How does refusal function even outside of you, right? And how might you observe that? I also think the other way is we must think about, and this is where I think this draws on Sharp's work, but certainly also draws on Audra Simpson's work. What does refusal look like as for you, for your research and your ethnographic practice? How and when do you practice refusal? So first, I guess I want to think about refusal as ethnographic practice, right? There are these ways that when we're doing research, we know that as anthropologists and as researchers, that objectivity is not a real thing, right? But also, I think we have to go beyond that to think about how our presence and the collection of data, the collection of information, the collection of stories, um, how we might do that with care and with attentiveness, but also with a laser sharp focus on making sure that we are attending to not only the needs of our interlocutors, but also trying to make sure that we're keeping their physical selves, their bodies safe, but also their words, the things that they care about safe. And what I mean here is that when we animate refusal, there is this way that we also have to have a commitment to not share everything, right? I always use this example with my students. There are moments in the field where I distinctly knew that someone switched from talking to me, Ashanté, the researcher, to me, Ashanté, their friend. And I think these are moments that you have to attune yourself to pay attention to, because the things that someone was willing to tell me, Ashanté, their friend, because they had forgotten that I am there in that researcher role, were things that I did not write about in my book. Could they have been interesting things to write about in my book? Perhaps. But could I have asked them, is it okay for me to write about these things in my book? Absolutely. But I think we can train ourselves to really lean into the reality that when we are building real relationships with people during our field work, which I think we should be trying to do, then those relationships necessarily mean that we are vigilant, that they do not turn into just extractive kinds of relationships. And this refusal to tell everything, particularly to tell things that we know someone may not want to be told or that could put someone at risk, is an important way to practice as a researcher. I think a second way to think about this is going back to that example that I started with. We can work with our interlocutors' no. We don't have to try to convince them that their no should be a yes. And honoring a no is a really important part of doing ethnography. It also is a part of practicing seeing someone. It's not just a hearing their no, but seeing their full being and seeing them as agents, as being able to make decisions, and that we should respect them. And I think related to that, I'm thinking about John Jackson's work here too, with refusing this idea that we have to be all knowing, and actually not just actively refusing that idea, but accepting that all ethnographic work is necessarily partial. It is necessarily incomplete. And to refuse this being the all-knowing ethnographer is really to invite in some ease, actually, to invite in this idea that the way you know and the way you understand this space isn't the only way, right? Your research participants, we're learning from them, we're learning with them, we cannot do the work without them. And so we must not see ourselves as elevated beyond them, right? Above them. And here on the screen, I won't read them aloud, as I'm sure well, actually, I will read them aloud for accessibility purposes, but I have two quotes here, one from Savannah Shangay's article, Black Girl Ordinary, where she asked the question, what does it mean to contour our method such that refusal is a part of the shape rather than an aberration? And then from Simpson's work, quote, to think and write about sovereignty is to think very seriously about needs. And that basically it involves an ethnographic calculus of what you need to know and what I refuse to write. And so here, this what you need to know as an audience and what I refuse to write as a writer, that relationship invites a practice of refusal. And so then, there's this other part, right, that I've already kind of talked about, refusal as ethnographic response that can be interpersonal, but it could also be response to the structural or spatial inequities or constraints. As again, I write about food access. And so a lot of my work has been thinking about how people navigate. I love the word navigate, how people navigate the built environment. And one of the ways that I write about refusal in my work is to think about how residents literally refuse the boundedness of the neighborhood space, right? It's a critique that boundaries of a neighborhood necessarily means enclosure. And they refuse that boundary daily in how they creatively think about how they're going to get food, thinking about ride shares and getting to other parts of the neighborhood, spaces where of the city, spaces where they might not are supposed to be, they end up there, right? So refusing this boundedness. And I think research participants do this a lot with our ethnographic research. We come in with a set of questions. We come in with a set of ideas of how those questions might be answered. We come in with sets of methods that we want to use. And sometimes when we see refusal in practice, it completely shapes our project in a different way. If you read my book, Black Food Geographies, I talk about that in the introduction, how the first 4 months of my fieldwork fundamentally altered what I was doing, because I'm wanting to know a certain set of things. I'm asking a certain set of questions. And in this negotiation with me, people are telling me things that they want me to know. There were not the questions that I was asking. They were in part essentially helping to shape the narrative or stewarding the narrative about the neighborhood that they wanted me to think more about. And I'm actually glad that they did. And again, that interlocutors are exercising sovereignty and agency in this process. They are not objects. They're not movable according to our theories or our methods. They are people that we need to think about as sovereign and capable, right, of navigating and stewarding our story, even our stories. So I think, one of the things we have to think about are the kind of practical parts of doing this work, right? So it's like refusal. That's like, can you give me a technique? Can you tell me how I'm supposed to look at that? How do I find it? How do I know it's happening? It shows up very differently than me just giving you a way of how to do a semi-structured interview, for example. And so I think these are some questions that you might ask in your own practice of refusal, and then also recognizing refusal within your interlocutors. Is it a no, or is it a not right now? Are you being persistent, or are you being pushy? Could the forms of refusal you observe compromise interlocutors' safety or well-being? And what needs to be shared, and what can you intentionally omit? These questions are necessarily hard questions sometimes. We do not always know. And for me, I tend to err on the side of respect, treating a no as a no, and assuming that it is that and not a not right now, unless there's something ambiguous about it. As I already mentioned, I know myself as an ethnographer that I'm not necessarily persistent once someone tells me no, that I tend to respect it. But I think also this idea of safety and well-being for people who are doing work in on violence, for example, you might think about this quite often. You might be thinking about it might be at the forefront of your brain whenever you're working with communities, but even for those of us who are not doing research on overtly violent processes, these are things that we must think about. We must think about safety, we must think about well-being, and we must think about how refusals might actually show up as a way for people to protect themselves and their own safety and well-being. So I want to return to this idea of refusal that I started off with this story. And what I ended up writing about in the book was actually what I call quiet food refusals, the ways that these quotidian ways that people were navigating, as I said, but also resisting. And the reason I say quiet food refusals was because they're not attention seeking, they're not necessarily loud. As I mentioned, they're quotidian and they show up in everyday ways. And so I got there because of that earlier experience with the elder, right? Even though I never got to interview her, even though I actually never spoke to her again personally, although I saw her in some other community meetings that I went to, she helped me to think about the ways people gently prod, sometimes forcefully, but the ways that people interlocutors can gently prod us to think differently about the questions that we're asking and to steer us in different directions, right? So I literally started listening for what was underneath the surface. I started listening and looking for things that were quiet, were not the big loud rallies, right? And it's those refusals that helped me really think about what I think is fundamental for moving toward a more just and more food justice, et cetera. So I guess I would just say, the last thing I want you to remember is that refusal is a dynamic set of negotiations and arrangements. They're always in flux. They're always being, and by negotiation, I mean that if people are navigating different spatial configurations to meet their needs or different politics to meet their needs, then there are always necessarily some different kinds of ducking and dodging that people are doing to meet those needs, right? And so it's dynamic. And it means that we have to pay attention and we have to be attuned to the fact that things are ever changing, right? And I will end with I mentioned Sadia Hartman's book earlier, Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments. And in it, she is teaching us how to look for refusal. She is teaching us how to hear refusal. And often to see and to hear, you have to go well beyond just the surface level, right? And actually, she gives us a very beautiful critique of just looking at what's on the surface, right? But to look deeper and to see how people are enacting refusal in their daily lives. And one of the things that she talks about is that there are other arrangements of the possible. And so I would just say that I think refusal, whether it's you as the ethnographer practicing refusal as a set of political demands in both your writing and perhaps your activism and your organizing, or if it's your interlocutors practicing refusal in how they negotiate you or the space in which you are doing field work, it doesn't matter. Refusal animates different arrangements of the possible. So it's not something that we should fight against, actually. I think taking Savannah Shangai's words to heart and thinking about it as part of the shape of ethnographic work, I think that helps us do more good. Thanks for listening.